"Lady, you don't know what you're talking about." Judge Joe Brown's voice cracked like thunder, sharp and raw, reverberating off the walls. The words didn't just hang in the air, they crashed into the room like a storm, pulling every eye toward him. His chest heaved, his tone rising higher, sharper, as if volume itself could bend the truth to his side. For a split second, time seemed to stutter. The crowd blinked, caught between disbelief and a creeping unease, wondering if they had just witnessed the moment dignity would be drowned out by rage. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Even those who often cheered Brown's fiery style shifted in their seats, unsettled by the sheer force of his outburst. The clash wasn't just about words, it was about worlds colliding. On one side, an aging figure gripping desperately to authority, using noise as a weapon. On the other, a young congresswoman, sharp and steady, refusing to flinch in the face of the roar. It was more than a debate, it was a collision of eras, values, and respect itself. Brown leaned forward, jaw tight, as though his sheer presence could erase the sting of his tone. But the damage had already been done. His shout was not simply heard, it was felt, an earthquake that cracked open fault lines of arrogance and disrespect, exposing them to the light. And in that widening silence, something else stirred, anticipation, because everyone watching both in the room and across screens that would soon replay the clip endlessly knew that moments like this don't stay suspended for long. A storm, no matter how loud, always meets its counterforce. And in JasmineCrockett.com, but unyielding, history had delivered the perfect answer. The audience leaned in, breaths caught between shock and curiosity. Would she retreat? Would she lash back in kind? Or would she craft a response so devastating it would echo far beyond that room? The stakes had shifted. This was no longer about who could talk louder, it was about who would emerge with dignity intact. What unfolded in that moment wasn't just a clash between two individuals. It was the surfacing of a deeper tension, one that had been brewing beneath America's surface for years. Generations faced off in real time. An older man, once celebrated for his authority, leaning on his voice as a weapon, and a younger woman, unapologetically black, unapologetically bold, embodying a new standard of leadership. Judge Joe Brown had built a reputation over decades as a man who told it like it is. To some, that bluntness was refreshing. To others, it was arrogance, dressed as honesty. His brand of dominance thrived in an era where raising your voice was mistaken for winning the argument. He represented an old model of authority, one where deference was demanded, not earned, and respect was measured by who could silence the other. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, symbolized a shift that frightened those who felt the ground slipping beneath them. She had carved out her place not by shouting down opponents, but by slicing through them with precision, with intellect sharpened by experience and lived reality. She represented not just herself but an entire generation rising up to demand respect, on their own terms, especially women and people of color who had been told for too long to know their place. This was more than an exchange of insults. To Brown's supporters, he was the last bastion of a world they recognized, where authority flowed from age, gender, and sheer force of will. To Crockett's supporters, she was proof that the old rules no longer applied, that brilliance and courage could not be shouted down. Every glare, every pause, every breath between them carried meaning beyond the room. It was a referendum on what America calls strength. The debate pressed on, but no one was really listening to the words anymore. They were listening to what those words meant. Every time Brown raised his voice, he spoke for a generation unwilling to concede power. Every time Crockett held her composure, she embodied the defiance of those who refused to be diminished. And in that contrast, the stakes became clear. This wasn't about policy, it wasn't about personality. It was about who gets to define dignity in the 21st century. Would it be claimed by those who mistake volume for value, or by those who prove that strength comes from refusing to bend? The cameras captured it all, the sweat forming at Brown's temple, the steady gaze of Crockett that never wavered. Viewers watching from their homes leaned forward, knowing instinctively that something larger was at play. The battle lines weren't drawn in ink, but in posture, tone, and the unspoken rules of respect. And hovering in the air, almost tangible, was the sense that what happened next would not only define the outcome of this debate, it would ripple far beyond it, because this wasn't just about words. It was about who defines strength in America today. Before the shouting, before the trembling silence, Judge Joe Brown was a name synonymous with courtroom theatrics and old-school authority. For years, millions of Americans tuned in to watch him wield his gavel on television, his voice booming through living rooms across the country. He had a presence that demanded attention, sharp suits, sharp tongue, and an unshakable confidence that made audiences either cheer in approval or wince in discomfort. In the world of syndicated courtroom shows, he was a star. His rise was built on a promise of order. People admired how he cut through excuses, silenced those who tried to talk over him, and snapped judgments with absolute certainty. It felt refreshing. In a chaotic world, here was a man who wouldn't hesitate, who would not be cowed. But beneath that aura of control lay the seeds of a darker truth. Authority delivered through intimidation is a fragile thing, dependent not on respect but on fear. And fear, unlike respect, has a shelf life. Brown's style became his brand. He raised his voice not as a last resort, but as a first instinct. Where another judge might guide, he barked. Where another might persuade, he ordered. His authority didn't invite dialogue, it smothered it. To some viewers, this was entertaining, even cathartic. They reveled in his dominance, the way he reduced people to silence. But to others, his approach revealed a man less interested in justice than in performance. He played the role of the immovable patriarch, the voice of finality. In truth, he was playing himself, and that self was complicated. Kamara Brown's reputation was not immune to cracks. Headlines emerged over the years, angry tirades, combative interviews, public disputes, where his temper overshadowed his message. The very qualities that made him a spectacle on television made him volatile in real life. His bluntness often veered into insult. His insistence on control left little room for humility. He didn't just debate, he bulldozed. He didn't just disagree, he demeaned. There were moments when supporters still rallied to his side, defending his outbursts as honesty, as a refusal to sugarcoat reality. But slowly, the sheen of respect faded. Each new controversy chipped away at the carefully constructed image of a man in command. The gavel, once a symbol of order, began to sound more like a hammer pounding against his own credibility. Brown's fall from the television bench was not dramatic in a single instant, but gradual, the slow erosion of relevance. Yet his voice, loud, insistent, unyielding, remained his weapon of choice. And when stripped of the courtroom lights, that weapon became all the more desperate. His authority was no longer backed by the set of a show, the edit of a producer, the framing of a narrative. All he had left was the volume, and volume alone can only carry a man so far. This is the man who entered the confrontation with Jasmine Crockett, a man who had built a life on controlling the stage, who believed that dominance was the same as respect, and that silence meant victory. He carried with him the weight of a career forged in shouting down others, certain that the louder voice always prevailed. He was, in many ways, the perfect antagonist, not because he was evil, but because he was so deeply convinced of his own invincibility. But arrogance, when pushed too far, always meets its match. Brown had faced challengers before, but they often folded under his glare, his bark, his insistence that he alone commanded the room. What he had not faced was someone like Jasmine Crockett, woman who understood that true strength requires no shouting at all. As he raised his voice at her, history was preparing its lesson. A gavel can silence, but it cannot inspire. And in the battle to define respect, inspiration always outlives intimidation. What happened next would prove that the old playbook of dominance no longer held the power it once did. The stage was set for a reversal so sharp, so undeniable, that even a man who once judged others for a living would find himself judged by the very court of public opinion he had long ignored. The audience leaned forward, sensing what he could not, that his own downfall was already in motion, and it was being written not by the force of his voice, but by the quiet resilience waiting to answer it. Before she ever stood face to face with Judge Joe Brown, Jasmine Crockett had lived a life defined not by privilege, but by persistence. Her story didn't begin in the halls of Congress or the bright glare of television cameras. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where the law often felt like a tool used against her community rather than for it. From the beginning, she understood something many never have to learn, that if she wanted fairness, she would have to fight for it. That fight carried her through law school, where she entered as one of the few young black women in her class. The odds were stacked against her from day one. Professors underestimated her. Classmates dismissed her. Some assumed she had earned her seat through charity rather than talent. But Jasmine had no interest in their approval. She sharpened her intellect like a blade, taking late nights in the library, poring over case law, crafting arguments that silenced the same peers who once doubted her. She didn't just survive law school, she claimed her space and it taught her decision. To become an attorney wasn't about prestige or money. It was about protection, protecting the people who too often had no shield. As a defense attorney, she walked into courtrooms where prosecutors rolled their eyes, where judges expected her to stumble, where jurors were conditioned not to take her seriously. Again and again, she rose to the challenge. Every case was personal, not only for her clients, but for what it represented, the right of her community to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with dignity. Outside the courtroom, Jasmine's activism was just as fierce. She marched, she organized, she raised her voice, when others trembled in silence. But unlike those who mistake volume for power, her voice carried something heavier, conviction. She didn't shout to dominate, she spoke to uplift. Her fire wasn't reckless. It was disciplined, guided by a belief that justice could not simply be demanded from above, but must be built from below. Her rise into politics was no smoother than her path through the law. Running for office meant facing opponents who dismissed her as inexperienced, as too radical, as too much. She was told that voters wouldn't rally behind someone like her. But when the ballots were counted, the very voices meant to discourage her became the proof of her triumph. She had won, not because she bent herself into a shape more palatable for power, but because she refused to. Jasmine Crockett's leadership style quickly set her apart. Where others dodged conflict with empty smiles, she leaned into it with clarity. When she was challenged, she did not waver. Her calm presence belied the fire that lived beneath. She could dismantle an argument with precision, each word a scalpel that cut away falsehoods, each pause a reminder that composure itself is power. Her constituents admired her not only because she fought for them, but because she mirrored their own struggles. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to be doubted, to be told you didn't belong. She carried their battles into every room she entered, every committee hearing, every interview, and with each victory she became proof of something larger, that the future would not be written by those who shouted the loudest, but by those who refused to be silenced at all. This made her, in many ways, the perfect counterpoint to Judge Joe Brown. He embodied the old guard, a man clinging to respect through noise and intimidation. She embodied the new, a leader who understood that real respect is earned through courage and composure. Their clash was never just about two personalities, it was about the transfer of power from one era to another. And yet, Jasmine's strength wasn't the product of bitterness. It was the product of resilience. She didn't carry her scars as burdens but as lessons. Every courtroom, every campaign trail, every late-night strategy session had taught her how to weather storms without losing her balance. Where others crumbled under pressure, she sharpened. Where others lashed out, she leaned in. She was, at her core, a fighter, but one who knew that the greatest victories often come not from striking hardest, but from standing tallest. It was this mix of calm and fire that set the stage for what would come next. As Judge Brown's voice rose to a shout, as he tried to drown her in volume, Crockett did not flinch. She didn't need to, because her entire life had prepared her for this moment. She had faced worse storms and walked out stronger. She had been underestimated before and used it as fuel. The air was already charged when Judge Joe Brown leaned forward again, his voice cutting across Jasmine Crockett like a blade. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, this time louder, sharper, as though each interruption was proof of victory. His hand slammed against the table, rattling a microphone, the sound ricocheting through the room. To him, control meant disruption. To him, talking over someone was the same as winning. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked, steady, almost unnervingly calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush to defend herself. Instead, she let the silence after his words stretch, heavy and uncomfortable, until the tension was no longer hers to carry but his. For every second she waited, the weight of his outburst shifted back onto him. The composure she held wasn't passive, it was deliberate, a reminder that real authority doesn't need to shout. The audience, sensing the shift, stirred uneasily. A few leaned back in their chairs, avoiding eye contact, as though the sparks between them could leap across the room. Others craned forward, unable to look away from the spectacle. Phones were lifted, screens glowing as viewers rushed to capture the moment, knowing instinctively that this was more than ordinary drama. It was history brewing in real time. Brown pressed on, his words tumbling over hers before they could even form. His brow furrowed, his jaw clenched, his voice ricocheting like a hammer against steel. He gestured wildly, pointing, chopping the air with the conviction of a man desperate to be heard above everything else. But with each interruption, something shifted in the room. His dominance began to look less like strength and more like desperation. The harder he tried to control the conversation, the more obvious it became that he was losing it. Crockett leaned back in her chair, hands folded loosely, almost serene. It was a gesture that said, "I can wait you out." Her body language contrasted his every move. Where he was all noise and motion, she was stillness. Where he fought to seize the moment, she let the moment unravel on its own. The silence between his interruptions grew heavier, the pauses she allowed herself becoming louder than his shouting. Someone coughed in the back of the room. Cameras zoomed in closer, capturing the sweat glistening at Brown's temple, the fire in Crockett's eyes. The moderator attempted to intervene, but his voice was swallowed by Brown's booming insistence. Each attempt to steer the discussion was met with another interruption, another verbal jab, yet the imbalance was clear. Crockett hadn't lost her footing, not for a second. It was a duel of styles laid bare. Brown's strength came from overwhelming noise, a storm of sound meant to knock down opposition. Crockett's power came from the opposite end, unshakable.com, that turned every one of his outbursts into evidence of his weakness. The contrast was cinematic, almost too sharp to believe. The old guard shouting against the tide, and the new guard, unyielding, letting him burn himself out. Whispers rippled through the audience. Some shook their heads in disbelief at Brown's aggression. Others sat in awe of Crockett's patience. The clash no longer felt like a simple argument. It was becoming something larger, a living metaphor of America's crossroads, captured in a single room. And then it happened, one final interruption, the loudest yet, as Brown practically roared over her words. The room jolted at the force of it. Even Crockett supporters, hearts racing, wondered how she would answer, if she would finally rise to meet his volume. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, the kind of silence that swallows oxygen and demands release. For a moment, it seemed as though the shouting had won. Judge Joe Brown's booming voice had drowned out every attempt at dialogue. His interruptions coming like cannon fire, each one louder than the last. His hand still hovered in the air from his final gesture, his jaw clenched, as if daring Jasmine Crockett to speak. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, stretched so thin that even the faintest sound in the room shuffling papers. Nervous coughs echoed like thunder. And then Jasmine Crockett did something unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't a smirk or a sneer. It was calm, measured, and devastatingly confident. The kind of smile that doesn't rise from arrogance, but from certainty, from knowing, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the storm raging across from her was already spent. That single gesture turned the entire room. Brown's voice had been loud, but her silence was louder. She leaned forward slightly, eyes never leaving his. Judge, she began softly, almost too softly, forcing the room to lean in closer. You've spent your entire life shouting at people to make them listen. And yet, here we aren't. I haven't raised my voice once. Gasps scattered through the crowd. Heads snapped toward Brown, then back to her. Crockett let the silence linger again, just long enough for the weight of her words to sink in. Then she continued, each syllable deliberate, each pause sharpened, like a blade. You call it strength, she said, her voice steady, but what I see is fear. Fear that if you stop shouting, if you let someone else finish a thought, the world might realize you don't actually have the answers you claim. 2. Brown shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lips parted, ready to interject again, but something in her gaze stopped him cold. She didn't flinch, she didn't look away. She spoke as if she had the entire room and the entire argument in her hands. You want to talk about respect? Crockett pressed, leaning in now, her tone tightening like a vice. Respect isn't given to the one who yells the loudest. Respect is earned by the one who refuses to be silenced. And every time you try to talk over me, you don't prove your strength, you prove mine. The words hit like a gavel. The audience erupted, a mix of gasps and murmured exclamations. Phones tilted upward, thumbs tapping furiously as clips began uploading in real time. On Twitter, hashtags were already forming. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Judge shouted down. Memes were being born before the exchange had even finished. Brown blinked, visibly rattled. For a man who had built an entire career on control, on cutting others off mid-sentence, he suddenly looked small, cornered. He shifted in his chair, his booming voice reduced to a hesitant mutter. Now hold on, young lady, he began, but the authority was gone. The phrase sounded less like command and more like plea. Crockett didn't let him off the hook. She straightened in her chair, her voice lifting just slightly, enough to command the air without shouting. You've made a career out of silencing people, Judge, but this isn't your courtroom. This isn't your stage, and today, your gavel doesn't work. The audience gasped again, then broke into spontaneous applause. Even those who had remained neutral found themselves swept up in the current. The sharpness of her words left no room for doubt. The tide had turned. Brown attempted to recover, forcing a laugh, waving a dismissive hand. That's cute, he muttered, his voice cracking at the edges. But the damage was already done. The more he tried to dismiss her, the more obvious it became that she had already won. His laughter sounded hollow, defensive. His hand gestures seemed exaggerated, frantic, as though he could wave away the truth she had planted in everyone's mind. And Crockett, steady as ever, delivered the final blow. You see, Judge, men who are truly strong don't need to shout at women to be heard. They listen, they learn, they understand that respect isn't taken, it's given back. You can raise your voice as loud as you want, but history has already decided which voice matters here. For a long beat, no one spoke. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as though reluctant to break the silence that followed. Brown's face tightened, his eyes darting away for the first time. His authority, once unshakable, now hung in tatters. The crowd whispered in low tones. She shut him down. One murmured. She ended it, said another. Social media feeds lit up like fireworks, captions overlaying stills of her calm smile and his contorted expression. This is how you deal with arrogance. One tweet read, she didn't just answer him, she dismantled him, wrote another. Brown tried one last time to gather himself, fumbling for words. You think you've proven something here, but his sentence collapsed under its own weight. His voice lacked conviction, his words tumbling into the void. It was clear to everyone watching. The man who once prided himself on dominating the room had lost it completely. Crockett, sensing the moment had reached its peak, sat back in her chair with that same quiet smile. She didn't need to say another word. Her silence now spoke louder than his every shout. The duel was over, and though he still sat across from her, larger in stature, older in years, he looked diminished. The room buzzed, alive with energy. The audience felt it, the cameras captured it, and the internet magnified it. Judge Joe Brown had shouted. But Jasmine Crockett had answered, and in doing so, she flipped his arrogance into regret. He had raised his voice. She had raised the stakes, and in the end, his roar was nothing more than an echo fading into her calm command. But as the room settled and the applause swelled, one question lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable. If this single exchange could shake his confidence so deeply, what shockwaves would ripple outward once the world saw it? The answer was coming in. It would be bigger than either of them could have imagined. The clash between Jasmine Crockett and Judge Joe Brown might have ended in the studio, but the real battle began the moment the cameras stopped rolling. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were online. By the time Crockett left the building, hashtags were already climbing the charts. Hashtag Crockett Clapback, hashtag Judge, shouted down, and the blisteringly popular hashtag Silent but Deadly surged across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The internet had chosen its victor, and it wasn't the man who shouted the loudest on TikTok. The moment Crockett leaned in and calmly said, "This isn't your courtroom. This isn't your stage. And today, your gavel doesn't work," was replayed on a loop, often set to dramatic music or remixed into punchy edits. Memes captured Brown's stunned expression, comparing him to cartoon characters caught off guard. One viral tweet showed a side-by-side of a roaring lion and a calm house cat, captioned, "Joe Brown versus Jasmine Crockett in one frame." But it wasn't just humor. Commentary exploded across the political spectrum. Supporters praised Crockett's composure, calling her the embodiment of modern leadership. Critics of Brown, long wary of his old-school bluster, saw the moment as the overdue unraveling of his persona. Even those who had previously dismissed Crockett found themselves nodding along, impressed by how she dismantled him without ever raising her voice. Political figures quickly chimed in. One senator tweeted, "Strength isn't volume. Representative Crockett just gave a masterclass in real leadership." A mayor in another state posted a clip with the caption, "For every woman ever told to calm down while being interrupted, this was for you." Even rivals who had sparred with Crockett in the past admitted her poise was undeniable. One said bluntly, "I may not agree with her politics, but respect is due." That was surgical. Celebrities piled on as well. A-list actors reposted the clip with flame emojis, musicians quoted her lines in Instagram stories. A popular late-night comedian opened his monologue with the joke. Judge Joe Brown thought he was running a courtroom, but Jasmine Crockett reminded him it was open mic night, and he bombed. The audience roared. For Brown, the fallout was brutal. His defenders scrambled, trying to spin the confrontation as staged or unfair. Some claimed editing had made him look worse. But the raw, uncut footage left little room for doubt. Every time his voice cracked, every time Crockett's smile disarmed him, the internet replayed it in slow motion. The more his supporters tried to minimize the moment, the bigger it became. The shift in public perception was undeniable. Once known as a commanding, if controversial, figure, Brown was now the butt of endless jokes. His decades of courtroom bravado had been undercut in a single exchange by a younger, calmer, sharper opponent. What he had intended as dominance now looked like desperation. Meanwhile, Crockett's star rose higher. The clip wasn't just a viral moment, it became a cultural reference point. For women who had been interrupted in boardrooms, for young activists dismissed as inexperienced, for everyday people told to sit down and be quiet. Her clapback resonated like a rallying cry. For millions watching, one commentator on a popular podcast said, "It wasn't just her win, it was their win. She stood her ground, didn't lose her cool, and proved that composure can be more powerful than volume." That's what people saw in her. That's why it landed. In living rooms across the country, viewers replayed the moment for family and friends. Parents showed it to daughters. Teachers discussed it with students. In workplaces, it became a shorthand for holding firm against overbearing voices. Pull a Crockett entered the lexicon. The emotional resonance was impossible to miss. Crockett hadn't simply defended herself, she had represented a collective experience. The universal frustration of being talked over, belittled, or underestimated. Watching her flip the script on Brown gave people a sense of vindication, as though they, too, had finally been heard. And as the days turned into weeks, the moment didn't fade, it deepened. Think pieces dissected the body language. Analysts described it as a generational clash, a symbolic passing of the torch. Memes kept the humor alive, but the core message endured. Arrogance and volume had been humbled by composure and precision. Brown may have shouted, but Crockett had left the last word. And in the court of public opinion, that word echoed far longer than any gavel ever could. When the dust settled, it was clear that the debate had never really been about who could shout the loudest. It was about something deeper, something universal, what true strength looks like. Judge Joe Brown had relied on volume, on force, on the old belief that power comes from dominating the room. For decades, that approach worked for him. But on that stage, in that moment, it faltered. Why? Because the times had changed. And so had the people watching. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win because of her wit or quick tongue. She won because she reframed the entire fight. Her silence before speaking, her steady gaze, her measured words, they became a demonstration of a new kind of authority. She showed that dignity is stronger than shouting, and that substance will always cut through noise. In that way, the clash wasn't simply personal, it was generational. On one side stood the old guardmen, who equated control with respect, who believed raising one's voice meant raising one's influence. On the other stood Crockett, part of a rising generation of leaders who understand that real respect can't be demanded. It has to be earned. For women, especially, the moment carried a special weight. How many times had women been told they were too emotional when they raised their voices, only to be interrupted by men shouting over them? How many times had dignity been mistaken for weakness, or composure dismissed as passivity? Crockett shattered that narrative. She proved that calm doesn't mean powerless, it means unshakable. And for men watching, fathers, sons, colleagues, the moment posed a challenge. It asked whether respect could be redefined, not as dominance, but as balance, not as control, but as listening, not as loudness, but as clarity. This wasn't just a victory in a debate, it was a cultural checkpoint, a reminder that America is still negotiating what leadership means, what respect demands, and who gets to define strength. Crockett's response to Brown became more than a clapback, it became a statement of values. Her moral stood out clearly. Arrogance will always crumble when faced with truth, and noise will always fade against the power of calm. The beauty of her response wasn't that it humiliated Brown, it was that it elevated the conversation. Instead of lowering herself to his level, she raised the bar. She didn't fight fire with fire, she fought fire with water, and the blaze sputtered out on its own. That's why the moment lingered. Because people didn't just see a political skirmish, they saw a lesson in how to carry themselves. They saw a roadmap for dignity. And in a world where arguments often devolve into shouting matches and insults, Crockett's composure became something rare, something to aspire to. In the end, her victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, to everyone who had ever been shouted over, to everyone who had ever been told to sit down when they knew they had something to say in that moment. As one commentator put it, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending herself, she was defending dignity itself. And maybe that's the greater takeaway. That dignity doesn't need to be loud to be heard. That calm doesn't mean weak. That substance will always outlast spectacle. The clip may fade from trending pages one day, but its message won't, because what Crockett modeled was timeless. The courage to remain steady when others lose control. The strength to use words instead of volume. And the wisdom to know that respect isn't shouted, it's earned. Judge Joe Brown may have walked onto that stage believing his voice would overpower anyone who dared challenge him. For years, that booming authority had been his weapon, his brand, his shield. But on this night, his shouting didn't end in dominance, it ended in regret. His attempts to belittle Jasmine Crockett only revealed his own weakness, while her composure transformed the debate into something larger than either of them. This clash was never just about two personalities. It was about what kind of leadership resonates in today's world. Brown embodied the old guard, loud, domineering, unwilling to listen. Crockett embodied the future, measured, confident, principled, and in that collision, the lesson was unmistakable. Noise fades, but dignity endures. The moment didn't just belong to Crockett. It belonged to every person who has ever been talked over, underestimated, or dismissed. Her victory was a reminder that you don't have to match arrogance with arrogance, or volume with volume. Sometimes, the strongest strike is calm, clarity, and that's why this story matters beyond the headlines, beyond the memes. It's not just about watching someone clap back, it's about recognizing the kind of voices we want amplified in our society. So here's the challenge and the invitation. If you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's deserve to be amplified, voices of dignity, composure, and truth, then join us. Subscribe, share this video, and keep this conversation alive, because every time we elevate leaders who stand for respect over rage, substance over spectacle, we move one step closer to a culture where shouting no longer drowns out truth. And that is a movement worth building together.